Welcome, porters, to another lore summary video. I am Fragile Boson, your logistics support officer. This lore summary will cover everything the game wants you to know about death, life, necrosis, and other topics related to death, life, and necrosis. In Chapter 3, this will take us right up to the large weather event that takes place at the end of your delivery to South Knot City. So to avoid spoilers, you should have completed the game up to that point. Let's get started. I want to start this video talking about Dead Man's email that we talked a little bit about in Dead Man's video, but I want to go just a little bit further into this thought process here. Dead Man writes an email to ask the question, if humans are complex multicellular organisms, how many cells need to die for us to consider someone dead? Or are there any cells in particular which determine whether someone is alive or dead? And he makes the point that the exact point of death can't be calculated by cell counts alone. But you also can't deny the existence of degenerative diseases that kill a person's cells, so that on a cellular level, a person could be partially dead as the disease progresses. Notably, this is different than cancer that actually creates more and more living cells, which is the disease that killed President Bridget Strand. We also find out that Dead Man is composed of many parts of other people, and they still work. So would their original owners be said to be alive? Dead Man doesn't really know. And he actually brings up the old argument, the old philosophical discussion of the ship of Theseus. And the ship of Theseus, according to Wikipedia here, is a thought experiment about whether an object that has had all of its original components replaced remains the same object. According to legend, Theseus, the mythical Greek founder king of Athens, had rescued children of Athens from King Minos after slaying the Minotaur, and then escaped on a ship to Delos. Every year, the Athenians commemorated this legend by taking the ship on pilgrimage to Delos to honor Apollo. The question was raised by ancient philosophers after several centuries of maintenance: if every part of the ship of Theseus had been replaced one at a time, was it still the same ship? And the parallel here to Dead Man is obvious. If he's just is he Dead Man as a singular entity, or is he Dead Man the sum of his parts? Because if he's the sum of his parts and all of his parts are unoriginal with him, how could he be who he is? It's a really interesting thought experiment. But the one that I wanted to spend a little bit more time in about is this question about whether or not it takes a certain cell count to die or certain cells to die in order to consider somebody clinically dead. And, that is a difficult question to answer. I found an article on the Walrus that talks about this a little bit, and the article was written by Blair Bigham, and there are two paragraphs I'd like to read just out of this article that kind of bring this problem into focus a little bit. The author writes, "When I started medical school in 2012, my thinking was challenged. In the hospital, people seemed to die, slower than they did in the field. There was often no car accidents or bullets or torn aortas that I could point to as the cause of their demise. Death was no longer sudden. Instead, I tended to people who were dying, a process that could take days, weeks, months, or even years. The line between life and death started to feel blurry. When I started working in the intensive care unit as a senior medical student, that line became even harder to bring into focus." She continues, "I'll never forget one boy who was admitted to the children's critical care ward after an emergency surgery. He was incredibly sick, on life support. One night, his pupils stopped reacting to light. I remember the doctor in charge, my boss, confided that the boy was probably brain dead. 'We'll do formal testing in the morning,' he told me. Probably and dead don't usually go hand in hand. As doctors, we want to be sure. We want time to react if we can. But once the word brain is smashed between probably and dead, determining time of death becomes only more complicated." And the question is when does that person actually die? When are they dead? If they take them off life support and they're brain dead, of course their physical body will stop operating and they'll eventually die due to either a oxygen deprivation, or their brain can't regulate their heart rate or their other body functions. But was that person dead at that point when their heart stops beating, or were they dead before that when their brain stopped functioning? It's just a really interesting question to raise, and it will become more important for Death Stranding in the next chapter when we talk about Mama. So just kind of think about this for a while and hold on to some of these thoughts, and we'll get back to it, and we'll see how Death Stranding handles it when we talk more about Mama in the next couple chapters. It's Deadman also that writes to us and says that blue is said to be the color of death due to experiments with C. elegans roundworms, which glow blue under UV light, but only after death. There is a reaction that happens, and I found out that this is 100% true. It's these C. elegans roundworms, when they die, there's like a blue flash that will radiate through their body. I would say very similar to the way that the Audra scan pings the land in front of you in that blue progressive wave. Very similar. A blue glow will permeate through or progress through the bodies of these deceased roundworms when they die. It's a reaction, it said, from the anthonylic acid, I think is how you pronounce that, within the organism. It's 100% true. And this is why Deadman at least believes there's no blue in the inverted rainbows. And the thought progression goes something like this. Timefall strengthens an area's connection to the beach, something to do with chiral particles being excited, right? And we heard about a little bit more about this in our chapter on chiralium, about how the rain clouds produce these gamma rays that excite particles and create antimatter, but also could excite the particles of chiralium in the air. So in these places with timefall, however it works functionally, their connection to the beach is strengthened because of the chiralium and the timefall. In spaces that are connected to the beach, electromagnetic waves with a blue wavelength can travel easily through the seam, which kind of leaks out then onto the beach, is what he says. And you can see this whenever you see the scenes of Sam stranded in the seam. It's all blue. The only thing that's not blue is Sam, who is repatriating because he's alive, right? It's all blue. Some people think that's where the blue from the inverted rainbows go, that the blue, because the wavelength travels easily through the seam, it actually leaks out onto the beach, and that's why we don't see the blue part of the spectrum in the inverted rainbows, because the blue is leaking out onto the beach because the wavelengths can travel faster. Either way, whether or not that's true, whether or not Deadman's hypothesis about why we don't see blue in the inverted rainbows, and also given the blue flash from the C. elegans roundworms, blue is an important color and it has a strong connection to death. We also find out in Chapter 3, through looking through Hartman's emails and interviews, some more information about how the idea of death has probably evolved to help mankind. He asked the question, when was it that mankind started to come to grips with his own mortality? Like, when did mankind start to understand death? Hartman theorizes that it's reasonable to assume that we began to understand death when we started burying our own dead, and this started with Neanderthals. I've seen some people say pretty, definitively lately that we didn't evolve from Neanderthals, but the more I look into it, the more the science seems to be out on that there still exists a possibility that we evolved from Neanderthals, or at least part of our population did, or something like that. But either way, it's safe to say that when people started burying their dead, there seems to be made some sort of significant connection with the event of death and honoring someone's life. They started to realize, like, oh my gosh, we're all going to stop at some point in time. And so they started realizing that, burying their dead. That's maybe when mankind first came to grips with their own mortality and their own understanding and comfort with death, or lack thereof. You could say that our growing understanding of death drove our development as a species. We have a fear of death that we attempt to conquer, that we attempt to overcome at times. Sometimes we listen to our fear of death that keeps us out of situations that could have and probably would have killed us. Hartman notes that it could be argued our entire history revolves around our obsession with death. Mummies were created in ancient Egypt, he writes, so that the Ka would have a Ha to return to, so that way, in some way, we could essentially become immortal. But, he, at the end of his interview, reiterates that now that the Death Stranding is here, our concept and relationship with death must evolve even further to serve humankind a better purpose. We also see an interesting email in this chapter about the coral that is seen in the seam, or the creatures that are around the coral. Have they evolved somehow, the question is asked, to live in that valley between life and death, between time and timelessness? It's very possible that this has happened, but these, he says, would have to be very hardy, surviving creatures. They've been around for 540 million years, and he's talking specifically about coral at this time. It makes sense that it would be coral because they're very hardy, surviving creatures, been around for 540 million years, and they have survived extinction events. And by the way, this is real. The 5 extinction events are real things that have happened. You can look these up online. However, there are some creatures, coral being one of them, that have survived all of these real extinction events. And so is there some connection or some evolutionary step that coral has undergone that mankind has yet to experience, where we could really live in that between life and death area and perhaps survive extinction events? And maybe that's where the next games are taking us. I don't know. The final thought on the matter from the entire chapter is that all things die. But what sets humans apart from everything else is our capacity to understand the implications of death, to imagine what it means like to no longer exist. And I mean, yes, we can talk about the classic Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life, at this point. I'm not going to right now, but it really helps you understand and really dig down into this thought process that what makes people different from something else, anything else, plants, animals, is our capacity to understand the consequences that death has on our lives, and for us to plan long term in spite of, or maybe even because of, our own impending death. Death is something that exists in the real world. Everything dies. Everything comes to an end. And it's not something that people are overtly comfortable with. And I'm just saying that in my experience working in hospice. I am comfortable around death. I'm comfortable around dying people. I'm comfortable talking about death as an issue, or as a thing, as an entity, as an event, as a process. I'm comfortable in those realms, but every day I meet people who are not. And, death was one of those things that in our society was much less scary than it was today. It used to be that when people died, most of the time they died at home and family was there, sometimes young children involved in the process of a person dying, and it was just seen as a natural part of life. But with the rise of medical institutions and our real quest for living as long as we possibly can rather than living as deeply as we possibly can, there has been this medicalization of death. And so people started dying more and more in medical facilities like hospitals and nursing homes, and death was removed out of the home. It was no longer something that people experienced regularly, and it became like the mysteriousness of death, I think, allowed people to become afraid of it over time. And that's where our culture largely exists today, in this place of the fear of death. One of the things I love about Death Stranding as a video game is it seeks to help to overcome at least the fear of talking about death. It's something that permeates throughout the entire game, but it's like, because it's a video game, because we're in a different world, like a different universe, a different fantasy setting for this place, it's not as scary and we can talk about it more openly. But the fact is, if we don't start talking about death more candidly as a culture, we are all going to suffer those consequences of the lack of communication. And I love what Hartman says in these emails and these interviews here. Our knowledge of death has helped us as a species, as humanity. And it does nothing but harm us to take death from being something that we can all talk about together and something that we can all learn from and learn about and experience as a community or as a family. If we can't do that any longer, we are failing in the long term as a species. And I think that's one of the points that Hideo Kojima is trying to make with this game, is that death is not bad. It really is, in his mind, in the world of Death Stranding, death is a temporary separation. And I really believe that is true as well. But the thing about it is, the less we talk about it, the less we're confronted with it, the less we're prepared for it, the more scary it is, the more devastating it is, and the more we cannot evolve, and the more we're hindered from taking that next big step as human beings. So that's all for this lore video summary. I have been your logistics officer, Fragile Boson. Keep on keeping on, and remember, tomorrow is in your hands.